I'm going to say a few things about demographic changes in terms of these types of diagrams that are often talked about or depicted in those discussions. So what these charts do, they are effectively two histograms side by side showing population on one axis, and I'm going to try to use the pen here. So if you think of this as the main axis going up here, and you kind of have that as your y, and then you have the other axis. Oh, where did my pen go? Here it is. In the other two, you have one x-axis this direction, which is the female population count, and then this direction is the male population count. And then you, for any country, you just plot the number of people, in this case female on this side. You count up everyone in the age group of 0 to 4, and that is reflected over here as a percentage of the population. And then you take the next age segment, 5 to 9, and you do a count of that in the female and the male. So effectively then we see a population distribution as the entire double-sided histogram. With this left one, we see Nigeria, and it's a pretty typical image of some of the poorer nations in the world, what we sometimes refer to as the global south or developing countries, but where there is a large number of young people due to high birth rates and decreasing numbers of older people. Due to more recent surviving young population, and also earlier deaths than in more developed countries due to maybe lack of healthcare or other types of benefits of modern medicine. So we take that and contrast with a country like the United States in the middle. Then we see that the amount and the percentage of the population in these younger generations is much less. So you essentially have this constant level of number of people all the way up to the time that people tend to start dying. So around 60, 64, we see the first sort of dying off generations, and slowly increasing up to this little bar, which is a little bit of an anomaly because we're including everything above 80, and as people live longer and longer, and we certainly see that women live longer than men here, this becomes a little bit exaggerated. It's really a tapering off all the way up to the absolute oldest people in the country. So United States is an example of a very stable population right now, where the rate of increase is really very low, 0.6%, which is then the difference between the crude birth rate and the crude death rate. So the number of people dying in any one year, and then comparing that to the number of people born in any one year, that gives you the rate of natural increase as 0.6. So there's still a small increase in the United States population. But as you see here, the rate of natural increase doesn't include immigration. So anytime you look at these, you cannot just think of deaths and births. You also have to think about, is there any significant in-migration or out-migration. That will also affect this graph. And then we have interesting cases like zero growth or negative growth. Germany is an example of a country where there has been a population boom at one part where there were a lot of kids born, and they're kind of working their way up the age ladder. We have a similar one here in the United States, somewhat predating the German boom, but almost coinciding. And so the people around 45 to 55, or in the case of Germany, from about 40 up to 50. And then we have declining numbers of kids born, down to a point where there's very little newborn in this country compared to the rest of the population. So the rate of natural increase in Germany is currently negative, which means that if we only look to births and deaths, we would have a negative trend. Now, if you probably read about what is going on in Europe right now, there's a big immigration discussion, and a lot of refugees, both from Africa and the Middle East, do arrive in Germany. So there's actually a population increase, which is welcomed by the German government, because these types of patterns is problematic, given that in the long run you see a growing number of retired people that is effectively going to live off the productive years of the population that is increasingly smaller. And you will see an example of that in the latter part of this module. Now, look at this a little bit differently. There are models that try to describe these different stages. So the leftmost of those graphs, the Nigeria situation, with high birth rates and relatively high death rates, is often referred to as the pre-industrial stage. We then have this green birth rate and the blue death rate graphs as examples of sort of descriptors of what might go on in this pre-industrial stage. And there might be fluctuations up and down depending on what type of environmental impacts. There might be bad growth a year and things like that affect the birth rates. And then it is often thought that these countries enter what is called a transitional stage. And this would be the first step in a developing nation's journey towards a fully industrialized modern society. And what we typically see then is that death rates decrease as a direct effect of better healthcare. And while birth rates remain, partly due to cultural preferences and sort of just general traditions of having many kids. But as this continues, we often see birth rates decline as well, and that's when we enter the stage 3 of the transitional times, when these developing nations starts to adjust the birth rate as well, so families feel more secure about their future, don't need to feel the need to have as many kids to support their older years. And so we see a general decline of the birth rates until we reach what is often termed the stage 4 industrial stage, where we see United States currently. You can see some additional explanation of this following this link. Now, if we look at this in another way, in a more dynamic way, maybe, a third type of diagram that we're going to look at is a type of graph that shows birth rate on one axis and death rate on the y-axis. And with stage 1 being plotted around here, this is where we would find the pre-industrial stage nations in a graph like this. And as we go through stage 2 with declining death rates, we would see countries kind of moving first down and then a little bit more to the left because of the combined decrease of death rate and birth rate until we reach the lowest level of death rates and birth rates of the industrialized nations. So if we sort of look at that alone, we're going to compare that model to the reality with the help of this interactive graph. You can see the shortcut up there. You'll find that shortcut in Carmen as well. Now you see this graph, again, this very schematic model, death rates, birth rates, on top of this interactive graph that I'm going to switch to just in a second. We have the same variables, birth rate, right down here, births per 1,000 population, and death rates, deaths per 1,000 population. Here we have that interactive graph, and this is the Gapminder website that you will look at, or maybe already have looked at. So here we see that model. We see that parts of the global south, the developing world in South Asia, East Asia, parts of East Asia, South and Sub-Saharan Africa, is really up here in that pre-industrial to transition to stage. And if we look at Northern Europe, Europe and Central Asia, and also at the Americas, we see either truly industrialized stage. We have United States right there, together with lots of European countries, and then in this transitional stage we find other nations across the Americas, Central America, South America, and also Central Asia and Eastern Asia. This is 1953, and this is where we used to be about 60 years ago. Now, if we play this forward, it is going to progress. I'm going to slow down the speed a little bit. And we play this forward, we'll see how these nations progress slowly according to that model you just saw, that kind of theoretical. But you see those bouncing things? That, I was trying to stop it, but this is how you do it with live. So here we go. We had some bouncing going on. Here's one shooting up. What is that? Death rates going up. Rwanda, huge crisis, internal conflict and civil war increased the crude death rate enormously. So that's a typical pattern of some kind of conflict or war scenario. You have something bouncing straight up, and we didn't see much more after that. But you can play around with this by following the link. And I would encourage you to look at all kinds of variables. It's really interesting. You have tons and tons of different variables that you can add to these axes and study over time. So I encourage you to do a little bit of that. All right, back to my short lecture here. This is one example of what you can do. You can track certain nations by turning on tracking. This is as simple as just clicking on a nation like this. It kind of grays out the others and now highlights Nigeria. And you can turn on what's called trails. And by fast forwarding or reversing, you can see that it paints a trail of how it progresses through these years. You can see that Nigeria starts this descent in terms of crude deaths going down, and then starts a trajectory towards the left, which is decreasing birth rates. But you see it's not a clear picture. It wiggles a little bit back and forth, and these are all related to various events, and some countries behave more sort of model perfect than others, and you're actually going to investigate that a little bit in the quiz as well. Now, the final thing I'll say is that a lot of people now seeing examples like Germany or Japan, that we have an example video of at the end of this module, we need to add a stage 5, which would be maybe called post-industrial. This is when the demographic transition not only stabilizes at the low level of replacement, but actually declines to a level where the natural rate of increase is not enough to keep up. So we get declining numbers, declining populations, rather than stabilized at a particular level. And exactly what's going to happen here is still unknown. We're kind of in uncharted territory because we haven't really seen this type of development. And the video about the Great Japanese Retirement is trying to dig deeper into that very phenomenon. So I hope you enjoy those pieces and that this short lecture was informative.